Hey, I'm Mike Gilliam, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. The legal battle between Fox News and Dominion Voting Systems continues to heat up, and with it, there's been a torrent of damaging information in the headlines. A lot of it, but not all, coming from depositions given by Fox head Rupert Murdoch and texts from primetime host Tucker Carlson. According to the Associated Press, in a text conversation from January 4th, 2021 with an unknown person, Carlson said, quote, "We are very, very close to being able to ignore Trump on most nights." In another text, Carlson allegedly said, quote, "I hate him passionately." This while lying to their viewers and supporting the former president and the big lie on the air. Referring to hosts Sean Hannity, Jeanine Pirro, Maria Bartiromo, and former host Lou Dobbs, Fox honcho Rupert Murdoch admitted several hosts endorsed false claims that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. He said, quote, "I would have liked us to be stronger in denouncing it in hindsight." This has prompted legal experts to describe Dominion's $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit as extremely strong. All of this has the makings of one of the largest media scandals in history. Here to help us understand what it all means and where it's expected to go, we have two guests. A professor in the Department of Media Culture at CUNY of Staten Island and author of the book Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class, Reese Peck, and the publisher of Black Star News, Milton Alimati. This is Let It Rip. Welcome to both of you. Milton, let's start with you. For years, people have questioned how Fox has handled Donald Trump and also the big lie. What was your reaction when you saw all of this news breaking?
Oh, I was like, about time. It's finally catching up with them. I mean, obviously, I never liked their politics, but they could always argue that, we're giving a perspective, freedom of speech. This is a news media. So we can pretty much say whatever we want to say. And I think finally it's caught up with them. And this is going to be a tough one. When you have members of your own organization literally saying we were actually airing stuff that we ourselves didn't believe in, that's going to be a tough one to get out of.
Mm-hmm. Reese, what was your reaction?
I think it's the whole thing, January 6th, and what the Dominion lawsuits revealed it's really a cautionary tale about news organizations that build their whole identity on partisanship. It shows how that goes too far. When it goes too far, you have hosts spread falsehoods just to appease a political leader and their devoted followers. And what that does is it creates this pretext for authoritarian power plays and political violence that we saw so dramatically displayed on January 6th.
Right.
So but this is kind of a backstage insight into the tensions they have when you're cultivating this partisan audience. It's almost like Frankenstein, right? The monster can kind of go too far where you can no longer rein it in.
Mm-hmm. How damaging do you think that this is to Fox, even before the lawsuit?
I think, many liberals or leftists or even centrist journalists look at this like, yes, finally, they're being exposed, but I think we have to really reckon with the way in which Americans live in parallel media universes, and that they're hearing very little about this. The Fox audience and conservative Americans are hearing very little about this scandal. And Tucker Carlson goes on just as business as usual, right? I mean, there's no apology, there's no acknowledgement of it. So, I'd like to say that it's going to have some long-lasting reputational damage to Fox News, but I'm skeptical of that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, Milton, what do you think about that?
Well, they knew they were peddling lies. And that's why, in the case of Smartmatic, for example, they sued for actual damages, $2.7 billion. They say that's how much the value of the company has declined. But they're also asking for punitive. Mm-hmm. So I just can't imagine what will happen if they lose both cases, and in both cases we have actual damages and punitive damages.
Oh yeah, because we would start at like $4.2 billion, and that could be triple that. right?
We're talking Toast News, possibly, not Fox News.
Do you think it could wipe them out, Reese?
You know, Fox Corporation, which is Fox's parent company, is a transnational corporation owned by Rupert Murdoch. I mean, he has media properties around the globe. His pockets are deep. I do think it can hurt them significantly financially. But again, I think Fox Corporation is so massive and so profitable. I think he can leverage assets across his broad kind of media empire to save Fox. Fox is the main moneymaker. Fox is the root of it all, the most profitable asset, but he does have other assets across the globe.
And it seems to me that that is the word that has gotten them into trouble, profits, right?
Right. Right. I mean, Murdoch's interesting because to understand Fox Corporation and Murdoch, you got to realize he's not your typical corporate CEO. He's doing this balancing act between his financial objectives and then his political objectives. He is motivated by ideology and politics, but Fox kind of threw a wrench in that balancing act, right? Where the political part, as the audience has become radicalized and politicized, he can no longer kind of rein that in, and now they're going against Fox News themselves because Trump is leading them there. But they kind of set the conditions for this to happen. Right. And so now he's really afraid of the financial consequences of his political strategy. So the balancing act is not working at this moment.
One of the big things about all this has been that Trump has kind of played into all that. And he kind of set some of this up when he started to say things like, hey, maybe Fox isn't really with us. You know, maybe you need to go to One American News Network. Maybe we need to move over to Newsmax and that sort of thing. How much do you guys think that that played into all of what has transpired? Milton, we'll start with you.
I feel like Fox News got caught up in the Trump crowd, the masses that were following Trump, and they started behaving like the masses, following Trump blindly. They lost their judgment, and they lost the balancing act that you were talking about. They went too far. And as Rupert himself said in the segment you mentioned earlier, he felt they should have been a little more vigorous in denouncing when they thought they were crossing the line.
Do you think that that is all the cause of the hatred we've seen on January 6th, Reese?
Yeah, you know, we have to remember that Fox, you know, it had a lot of hubris in 2015 and 2016 that it was the kingmaker. You know, Fox was they called it the Fox primary or the Murdoch primary, that it decided what the winner of the Republican primary was going to be. Trump was the first candidate. You know, Murdoch and Ailes didn't like Trump, and Fox was actually against Trump in the very beginning. But once they realized he was the clear winner, then they aligned themselves after the fact. And that was the first hint that they're not in control, right? That was the first time we saw that Fox is not as powerful. Its grip over the conservative base is not as strong. And with now it's even more evident, right, that Trump is really running the show. And they are scrambling to maintain that audience. And yes, I do believe America, what was interesting as someone who studied Fox forever, is to see how insecure and scared they were of potential competition from Newsmax and American One Network, AON. And that really surprised me because I always thought that these were kind of too small to really challenge Fox, but they were truly afraid of being toppled by their competitors to the right of them.
Especially after the elections.
Right.
And I do agree, actually. I feel they contributed to inciting the folks that came out on January 6th, without a doubt.
So how do you fix this all now? I mean, it's ingrained, it would seem to be, in our whole political realm at this point. So how do you go about fixing that? I mean, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of people aren't even seeing this story now and the fact that they lied to their viewers.
Well, it's a tough one because, you know, then you get into the issue of like, should we have some control on media? And how much control is appropriate? And, you know, should we control media that, you know, we don't like?
Because you can't say, should the government fix this?
Absolutely, and that's the danger. I think perhaps, and I agree with you, as you said, possibly the financial consequences may cause them to have some reflection and perhaps behave differently in the future. I can't see them repeating the same way they did at this time and face the consequences financially again. But of course, we still don't know what the verdict is going to be.
I don't know, if I look at those depositions, especially from Rupert Murdoch, where he talks about, well, some of the commentators might have been a little bit too much on this, they might have gone too far. It sounds like a setup, like somebody could get thrown under the bus at this point. Is that what's about to happen?
Maybe, but I think back to your question about what do we do? I think the only way you beat Fox is fire with fire. You have to create a news brand that is as popular and resonates and as culturally relevant as Fox is. That's a hard road. That's a harder thing to develop. And one thing, regardless of how Fox has wielded populism, which I definitely critique, you have to respect its attempt to claim the working class as its own. Like, its brand is that we represent the working class. And so I think left media could take a cue from that, rather than, you know, having this kind of middle brow, emotionally muted, we're the smart people in the room style of news. They need to think about developing alternative news styles like Fox did, not go extreme, you know, and as you said.
That's what MSNBC is though, right?
Well, I think that they still play this game where MSNBC brands themselves as the intellectuals, and Fox is the populace. So I think leftists need to throw a wrench in that association, not accept that it's the right that are the populists that are for the working class, and they need to develop media brands that can challenge Fox on that terrain.
I agree with them 100%. I mean, MSNBC and the others, they're sort of elitists as well. So there is a need for that media that would counter and embrace the working class.
Okay, that'll have to be the last word.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests, Reese Peck, a CUNY professor and author of the book Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class, and the publisher of Black Star News, Milton Alamati. Thank you both. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'll look at banking troubles and ESG investing with State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. Stay with us. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. There's been a lot going on in the economic sector lately, with bank failures and President Biden's veto of a conservative attempt to roll back a rule supporting ESG investing by pension managers. Joining us now, we have New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli, whose job includes managing New York State pension funds to make sure the plans are solvent and New York State and municipal employees' retirements are safe and secure. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be with you.
Good to have you. The failures of Silicon Valley Bank in California and Signature Bank here in New York have been big news. What was your reaction when you first heard about all that?
It's very concerning news. You know, certainly for people who we know who are depositors, you know, the good news for them is that the FDIC is backing up their deposits, because there were some consumers, you know, directly involved with these banks. For our pension fund, right, because we're big, so we're invested in many different places. The good news is we had very minimal exposure to these two banks, so we're protected in that sense. The concern, though, is what happens from here. Will this result in more bank failures? Will this result in a market meltdown? We've already had challenges with the investment climate. Will this make what has already been a challenging time for investing even more difficult? So I think it's still too soon to tell on that front. I guess the good news is the federal regulators, and with regard to Signature, the state regulators, have moved very quickly to minimize the damage. We'll have to see, you know, how it all proceeds in the next couple of weeks. The issue, you know, most recently also is what's happening with European banks. What impact will that have on the U.S. banking system? So, as if we didn't have enough to contend with, now we have to contend with this dynamic.
I know the Biden administration has said that consumers should not be worried at this point, that their money is safe. I want to ask you, should we worry?
Well, again, the good news is that the federal regulators, FDIC, and here in New York State with Signature, they stepped in quickly. They guaranteed the deposits, even higher than the $250,000 level. So I think that, you know, that certainly should be reassuring. We've heard very directly from Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary that the system is strong and that the regulators would do everything they can to keep the system in strong condition. But, you know, clearly there were vulnerabilities with these banks. There's been a lot of discussion about some of the deregulation or rollback of some of the parts of Dodd-Frank a couple of years ago. Did that contribute, to what happened here? Was the reliance, in the case of Silicon Valley on the crypto world and venture capital, did that result in undue risk, and perhaps some of what happened could have been predicted? I think folks will be analyzing
is this in fact a result of the rolling back of those regulations?
Well, I think that's one of the issues that people are looking at right now is the fact that there was this argument that smaller banks should have had less of the regulatory framework that Dodd-Frank initially put in place because of their size, right? And in fact, during the Trump era, there was a rollback of some of that. Did that contribute to what happened here? Many are arguing, in fact, that was the case. Had they not rolled back some of that regulation, this would not have happened. That'll be for further analysis. But I think it's a fair question.
Okay, a lot of people are saying that this is the government then having to bail out those banks. And they also are saying that, hey, they seem to be very quick to do that, but not so quick to do student loan cancellation and debt cancellation and that sort of thing. How do you react to those two arguments?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, they didn't really bail out the banks, right? This is different than, 2008 when you had the global financial crisis, because these banks have failed, right? So the stockholders have lost their money. The executives are out of jobs, although there is some question about some of the payouts they received shortly before the collapse, at least with Silicon Valley Bank. So these banks have not been bailed out. They've not been saved. They're gone. And obviously there's some economic losses there. So I don't think it's fair to equate it with a bailout. What is being done, though, is to backstop the depositors to make sure that they don't lose their money. Why is that important? Because you don't want to see a run on the banks. And that's part of what you saw happen, in the cases here, and some concern about some of the other banks. People getting nervous, therefore they pull out their deposits. Then the banks fail, right? So the reason that the regulators are moving in to protect the deposits is so that people don't start taking their money out of all these banks. Because if the banks don't have the deposits anymore, that's how you have more bank failures. So we don't want to see more of that. So no, the banks haven't been bailed out, but they're trying to really keep the confidence there, so people don't start withdrawing their money from these regional banks and then move it into the bigger banks.
Now, Silicon Valley Bank had lobbied for that deregulation to try to get that in place. Were they at fault in doing that? I mean, in hindsight. Yeah,
I mean, look, on the face of it, yes, it would seem that was a mistake. But again, I think it's going to need more analysis. But I think folks are looking at lobbying, they're looking at political contributions from some of those executives to the folks that had, some of the decisions in terms of the deregulation. So this is all something that will be part of the postmortem. But look, I could tell you that with our investments with the pension fund, we know that this has been a very challenging climate. We didn't need now these bank failures on top of everything else that we've been challenged with, between the continued war in the Ukraine and what the Fed is doing and inflation. I mean, it's been a very tough time for all investments, particularly for public equities, for the stock market. This is just yet another shock, to the investment confidence, and it's going to make it hard for all of us who, you mentioned in the outset, we're concerned about retirement security for our public workers. Fortunately, our New York plan is well funded, but this creates a more challenging investment climate for us.
Let's talk about some of the things Republicans have been saying about the failures of the banks and investing in general. We keep hearing this word woke. And in fact, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been all over this, saying it's a woke bank. This bank, they're so concerned with DEI and politics and all kinds of stuff. I think that really diverted from them focusing on their core mission. What do you think about that line of attack?
Well, I mean, this whole discussion of woke, it just becomes, part of the political sloganeering. And I think it's a way to divert what is, I think, a more thoughtful analysis, which is what were the failings in the regulatory system, particularly in light of the deregulation that happened just a few years ago that, as you pointed out, that Silicon Valley had been lobbying for. So I think as the analysis continues, this notion of the fact that this institution, like many others, are concerned about the diversity of their workforce, that hardly was anything that impacted on the finances for their organization. That had to do with many other dynamics. Look, every organization today would be foolish if they're not looking at their workforce, at their human capital, making sure that they have a good working environment, that their workforce is open to the best and the brightest, regardless of what they look like or what their background is. I mean, that to me is smart management. So this continued attack on DEI or inclusion or ESG, it's just part of political slogans that really don't match the reality of what we're trying to accomplish.
So help us out here, because a lot of people are hearing about ESG and DEI for the first time. What is ESG investing, and why is that so important?
Well, from my perspective, ESG, the acronym stands for Environment, Social, and Governance, and it's kind of a broad umbrella to talk about issues that, from an investor's perspective, need to be considered when you are putting your money in a particular company. I always get, on the other side, if I can put it that way, is attacking ESG. What I really view ESG as an opportunity for us to reduce risk, right? And we were just talking about the risk that wasn't identified with these banks that failed. And I would argue that when we consider ESG factors with the companies we invest in as a pension fund investor, we want to minimize risk. If you are a company that has a terrible record on the environment, if your business practices are polluting and subject you to regulatory impact and enforcement, if you have a workplace where workers are harassed for racial or sexual reasons, and you're subject to all kinds of lawsuits and reputational risk, if you have a poor governance structure where you don't have appropriate metrics rewarding compensation to good outcomes, I mean, all of these are risks that need to be evaluated. And what you need to do from an investor point of view is engage with companies to make sure they're minimizing risk when you identify it.
Okay, that's going to have to do it. I want to thank New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli for all of the insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. We've discussed a number of important topics, from the Fox News Dominion Voting Systems lawsuit and all of the fallout, and what we're learning about what went on behind the scenes at Fox News, from election falsehoods to the motivation behind it all. We've also heard from State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli on bank failures and ESG investing. Good conversations. I want to again thank all of our guests for their insight. I'm Mike Gilliam. We'll see you next time on Let It Rip.